As John mentioned in the welcome, we're in a series of lessons called Journey Life, lessons from Old Testament people of faith. And for several weeks we have been in the book of Job. And the book of Job is a strange book. It probably is not your favorite book of the Bible. If it is, go see Brian Shepherd when he gets back. It's part of the poetry section of the Old Testament. In fact, it is an incredibly long Hebrew poem with a little bit of prose at the very beginning, a little bit of prose at the end. It is part of the wisdom literature, primarily the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And the reality is that all three of those books teach the exact same lesson. It's just that oftentimes we don't pick it up. And so we're going to be concluding the book of Job today. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this journey because it's helped me to step back and think of God in some very different ways that I needed to think of God about. And I hope that when the lesson is through today, maybe it's been a blessing to your life as well. One of the things you have to do if you're going to read the book of Job or study the book of Job is you have to understand the structure of the book. Because it is just really a very complicated book. It begins in Job 1 and 2 with two heavenly court scenes. In other words, we're transported to heaven. God is there. The sons of God, the heavenly beings are there. And one who is known as the Hasatan. Most translations simply translates it Satan, but Satan is not a proper name. Satan simply means prosecutor. It's the prosecuting heavenly being who's responsible for looking at the actions and the intentions of human beings' hearts. And God basically says to the Hasatan, have you noticed my servant Job? There's no one like him in the entire world. He's upright, he's blameless, he's incredible. And the prosecuting attorney of heaven says, yes, but does Job serve God because God blesses him or because he's God? He says, I think if you were to take away his blessings, he would curse you to the face. And so in chapter 1, basically God says, go ahead. And the Hasatan takes away his wealth, takes away his children, 7 sons, 3 daughters, in one horrible accident there at the house when a windstorm sweeps through. And yet, through it all, Job is faithful to the Lord. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And then the Hasatan comes back to God and he says, yes, but the reason he still serves you is because you've not touched his flesh. Touch him physically and he'll curse you to the face. And so God says to the Hasatan, go ahead. Go ahead. You can't take his life, but you can make him suffer. And of course he does. And it's a horrible suffering. Absolutely terrible. At the end of chapter 2, Job's 3 friends show up. We've heard some of their names perhaps in the past. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And we don't know anything about these guys, just like we don't know anything about Job. I mean, this is a wisdom book, okay? We can't place it historically. We can't place it geographically other than it's in the east. I mean, it's a lot of mystery involved in this book. But these 3 friends show up. And at first, everything goes well with them because they're silent for 7 days. But then they begin to argue with Job, and the arguments get ugly. And the basic point of the argument is that if you do what God says, you'll be blessed. And if you don't do what God says, you'll be cursed. Now, that is a basic principle of the Bible. Don't get me wrong. The only problem is it's a principle. It's not an absolute. You see, Job's 3 friends saw it as an absolute. And they end up convincing Job that it's an absolute. In other words, if you do what God says, you're going to be blessed. If you don't, you're going to be cursed. Obviously, Job is somehow cursed. He's lost his family, his health, his wealth. He's lost everything. And then in chapter 28, you get a weird, what's called an interlude. It's just one of these chapters that appears out of nowhere. Job doesn't say it. His 3 friends don't say it. It's just there. The author of Job says it. And you go, you read through it and you go, what in the world is that? And what it is a preview of what's going to come at the end of the book. I mean, it's almost a movie that pauses in the middle that says, can I give you a hint how this is going to end? It's just a hint, but it's there. And then you're right back to Job. And then in chapter 32, and we got to this young man last week, this young guy named Elihu comes out of nowhere. Yes, it tells us who he is. We don't know who he is. You know, I'm reminded of when I used to talk to my mother, and she'd say, well, you know, Miss So-and-so died. And I'd say, Miss So-and-so, I don't know Miss So-and-so. Yeah, you do. You remember Miss So-and-so. Y'all ever had that from your parents? I mean, you're like, Mom, I've been gone 40 years. I don't remember Miss So-and-so. Yes, you do. Okay, thank you. We don't know who Elihu was. But he appears and speaks for several chapters here. In fact, gives some of the longest of the speeches. And he's going to speak truth to Job. You're going to see that here in just a moment. And then finally the book ends when God comes down and speaks to Job, and Job draws conclusions from his conversation with God. There's the way the book's designed. And you have to know that. And one of the problems you have, if you're not careful, is knowing who's speaking when. Because sometimes it's the author, sometimes it's one of Job's friends, sometimes it's Job, sometimes it's Elihu, sometimes Elihu's talking to Job, sometimes he's talking to his friends. And you're like, man, this is hard to follow. Yes, it is. But the message is incredible. In Job 31, Job ends his remarks, for all practical purposes, by maintaining his integrity. He says, listen, if I've walked with falsehood, or my foot is hurried after deceit, if my heart's been enticed by a woman, or if I've lurked at my neighbor's door, if I've denied justice to any of my servants, whether male or female, if I've denied the desires of the poor and let the eyes of the widow grow weary, if I put my trust in gold or said to pure gold, you're my security. If I've rejoiced at my enemy's misfortune or gloated over the trouble that came to me. Job says to God, listen, if I've done any of that, I get it. I deserve this. But Job says I haven't. Job is an incredible example for all of us of how to live before God with integrity and being blameless. I can't do it. I haven't done it. I'm not sure anybody could do it, but Job obviously in the story does. And at that point is when Elihu shows up. And Elihu, when he shows up, he's angry. He's angry at Job's three friends, but he's very angry at Job. Notice, he became very angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. What Job is doing is Job's trying to figure out, why am I suffering? And he can't figure it out. And his three friends keep telling him, you've sinned. You've done something to anger God. That's why you're suffering. He goes, no, I haven't. And of course, here's this principle. If you do what God says, you'll be blessed. If you don't do what God says, you'll be cursed. He's obviously being cursed. And so he's like, okay, but I haven't done anything deserving of being cursed. So there must be something wrong with God. That's the only conclusion he could come up with. I mean, he's not cursing God. He's not turning away from God, but he's really struggling with his understanding of God. And I don't know about you, but I've been there many, many times. I mean, God, I just don't get this. What in the world are you doing? And so Job begins to make some comments. And Elihu basically gives four speeches. The first speech is 2 chapters. The second speech, 1. The third speech is chapter 35. And then 36 through 37 is his fourth speech. And in each of these speeches, Elihu is trying to inch Job closer to a proper understanding of God. And I love the way he does that. In his first speech, of course, he begins by declaring, I'm young. I don't know how old he was, teenager in his 20s, but he says, I'm young. He says, basically, wisdom used to come with age, but in this case, you see highlighted there, but it is the Spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty that gives them understanding. He says, I have wisdom because God has given it to me. It's kind of like Solomon when he's 20 years old and the Lord says, ask whatever you want and I'll give it to you. And Solomon says, give me wisdom so that I can govern your people in a proper way. And that's what's going on with Elihu. And so Elihu comes to Job, and the thing he wants Job to know is, I'm on your side. I know your three friends, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, said they were, but you discovered that they weren't. They weren't as good of friends as you thought they were. But look at what he says. Pay attention, Job, and listen to me. Be silent and let me speak. If you have anything to say, answer me. Speak up. But then look at the highlighted part. For I want to vindicate you. I want to vindicate you. Job, I'm on your side. And I want you to realize that. But if not, then listen to me. If you don't have anything to say, listen to me. Be silent, and I will teach you wisdom. Now, again, most of us, if a young person said that to us, is like, yeah, right. But in this case, it was right. And Job does listen. And Elihu does speak wisdom to him. First of all, he says, Elihu says to Job, Job, you're too busy defending yourself. You're not properly representing God in the process. As you're struggling with how to understand God, you're edging closer and closer to crossing a line you don't need to cross. Now, Job doesn't cross it. But the entire time he's struggling with it, his focus is the wrong direction. It's not on God. It's on himself. Notice what some of the things Elihu had heard. But you have said in my hearing, I've heard the very words, Elihu says. I'm pure. I've done no wrong. I am clean and free from sin. Now, that's not being stated in absolute. Job's simply saying, I don't know of anything I've done that I've not repented of and asked God to forgive me. I just don't know it. And that was legit. But then look at what he says about God. Yet God has found fault with me. He considers me his enemy. Job, that's what you're saying. God obviously has found fault with me, and he considers me his enemy. He says, but I tell you in this, you're not right. He says the problem with you, Job, is you don't realize that God doesn't think like we think. God doesn't look at things the way we look at things. God is greater than any mortal. And that's what you have forgotten. And I have forgotten. Perhaps you have forgotten. Way, way too many times. In his second speech, again, this is Elihu speaking. Job says, I'm innocent, but God denies me justice. God, you're not getting this right. You see what Job's doing? He's getting right up there to the edge. Although I am right, I am considered a liar. Although I am guiltless, his arrow inflicts an incurable wound, for he says there is no profit in trying to please God. Again, because Job is struggling so much, he's just trying to figure out, okay, God, you're obviously letting this happen. And I don't know why. And honestly, I'm starting to doubt, is there any good in obeying you, in following you? Now again, Job doesn't cross the line. He just gets up right to the edge of it. But the problem is he's still looking at himself instead of looking at God. So listen to me, you men of understanding, Elihu says. Far be it from God to do evil. Job, the Almighty's not going to do anything wrong. And you know that. Why do you keep getting up here and questioning that when you know that deep down in your heart? That's what you've got to rely on. In his third speech, Elihu says, do you think this is just? And again, he quotes Job, I'm in the right, not God. Yet you ask him, what profit is it to me? And what do I gain by not sinning? Again, just Job in his anguish trying to figure out, God, I've served you all of my life. I mean, maybe it was better if I've not served you. And Elihu says, really? That's what you're thinking? And so he says to him, I'd like to reply to you. Look up at the heavens and see. If you sin, how does that affect him? If your sins are many, what does that do to him? If you're righteous, what do you give to him, or what does he receive from your hands? Your wickedness only affects humans like yourself, and your righteousness only other people. In other words, God doesn't need us. He loves us, created us, but he doesn't need us. Kind of reminds me of my dad when he used to say to me and my two brothers, I brought you into this world. I can take you out. Y'all remember? Any of y'all ever heard that? I mean, that's basically Elihu saying, listen, it's not that you're necessary at all. Do you think your sinning affects God in heaven? Or that your righteousness, other than giving him glory, somehow changes him? He says your perspective's all messed up. And so in the last speech, he says, listen to this, Job. Stop and consider God's wonders. And then he just starts asking some questions that God is also going to ask here in just a moment. Do you know how God controls the clouds and makes his lightning flash? Do you know how God does that? I mean, when you see a storm like this, and we've all seen them, been amazed by them. That's the difference between me and June. A storm like this would roll up when I was a teenager. I'd go outside and watch it. When June would have a storm roll up like that, they'd be hunkering down, in the inner closet ready for the storm. Now, as I've gotten older, I've joined June. I'm embarrassed to say this, but when the tornado, came through and knocked, Hendersonville out, we're at the house, tornado warnings, heading for Madison. June's like, let's get in here. You get in that closet, I'll get in that closet. I said, June, there's a safer place. She said, where's that? Under the house. We need to get in the crawl space under the house. June's never gotten under the house, ever. 33 years living there. She's never climbed under that house. And so I put a tarp under there, lightning is flashing, storms are coming, and we climb under the house. And we're laying there as the storm is beating down, and June goes, so if the house collapses on top of us, and I'm like, yeah, I didn't think that one through. I mean, I did. I'm sitting here thinking, we're below ground level, we'll be okay, not if that thing comes down on us. These things can be amazing. And here's Elihu says, Job, have you figured that out? Should he be told what I want to speak? Out of the north, he comes in golden splendor. God comes in awesome majesty. The Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in power and his justice and great righteousness. He does not oppress, therefore. And there's the message of Elihu. People revere him. Say that with me. People revere him. That word revere means to hold in holiness, to respect, to honor. People revere him. And it's at that moment, and I can't help but go back to, how many of y'all have ever watched Forrest Gump? Any of y'all, Forrest Gump? June would tell you that I've only watched it like 300 times, okay? Not all of it, just bits and pieces of it. But in Forrest Gump, there's a scene, of course, Forrest is played by Tom Hanks. One of his best friends was Lieutenant Dan, if you remember Gary Sinise playing that role. And of course, Lieutenant Dan gets injured in Vietnam. He loses both of his legs. Forrest saves him. He didn't want to be saved. A lot of anger between the two. And then all at once, Lieutenant Dan shows up because Forrest has bought him a shrimping boat. But they're not catching any shrimp. And finally, he says, maybe you need to go to church. And next scene you've got, Forrest is in church and he's singing in the choir, asking God to give them shrimp. And finally they're out there and they're not catching any shrimp. And Lieutenant Dan turns to Forrest Gump and says, where is this God you believe in? And then the narrator, which is of course Forrest Gump, says, and God suddenly appeared. And if you remember the scene, it's a storm, just like this one. It is a storm. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me, if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. The one who's demanding that I come down and speak to you. Who stretched a measuring line across it? What is the way to the abode of the light, or where does darkness reside? I love those two, because when I was a little bitty boy, and I'm talking about maybe 3 years old, I never could figure out where the sun came from. I mean, in the mornings I'd see it come up, and then in the evenings I'd see it go down. And as a 3-year-old, my only way of understanding was that there had to be a big cave way over in the east, and the sun would come up out of that cave, and then it would go over here and go in a cave on the other side. I mean, that's the only way my little 3-year-old mind could get it. I'm not much better now, but that's at least what I used to think. Can you take them to their places? Do you know the paths to their dwelling? Surely you know. The one who demands that I come down, for you were already born. You have lived so many years. Now, one of the things you need to do when God shows up is you need to go back as a teenager and remember when your mom or your dad gave you that hard lecture. Do you remember that? I mean, the one of where they're going to speak truth to you, and they're not going to hold anything back. And when they do, you're not going to like it, but you know that deep down they love you. You know they're doing it because they care about you. And that's what's going on here, is that God is a father, a loving father. And boy, he is just tearing into Job like you would a teenager who's just teetering on the edge of rebellion. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth, Job? Do you watch then when the doe bears her fawn? Do you count the months till they bear? Do you know the time they give birth? Job, are you out there in nature seeing everything that goes on? That's the point he's trying to make. I mean, do you know when the rhinoceros, when it gets up in the morning to eat? Do you know when the hippopotamus goes to sleep? Do you know does the giraffe sleep standing up? I mean, do you know any of this? Are your eyes all around the world so that you understand everything? Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom, spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle soars at your command, builds its nest on high? Job, tell me, do you know any of this? And of course the answer is no. No, I don't. The Lord said to Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. In other words, God, you come down. I want you to answer some questions. And God comes down and says, now you need to answer some questions. Then Job answered the Lord, I'm not worthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, I will say no more. And so God keeps speaking. Brace yourself like a man. I'm going to question you and you answer me. He's already said it once. He comes back and he says it again. I mean, again, reminds me so much of my dad. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? The very point Elihu said. He said, Job, your problem is you took your eyes off of God when your 3 friends started talking to you, and you tried to justify yourself. And God said, I'm bigger than that. You're trying to find fault in me, and the fault is that you are trying to put me in a box. Remember the phrase, it's time for us to think outside the box? You have to think outside the box when it comes to God, because God's not inside the box, my brothers and sisters. He's not there. If there's a lesson I've learned in my old age, is that God is far more mysterious. And my understanding of Him is far less than I ever imagined. His ways are beyond my ways. His thoughts are above my thoughts. And I have to recognize that. Job had to recognize it. The author of Job, God, of course God's speaking here, he then brings up these two, and I think they're mythical creatures. One's named Behemoth. If you look, there's a couple of translations that'll translate this as hippopotamus. The only problem with it being a hippopotamus is that in the text, his tail is like a tree trunk. If you've ever seen a hippopotamus, they got little bitty stumpy tails. Okay? It's not like a tree trunk at all. And then he brings up later the Leviathan. And again, you've got a couple of translations that translates it crocodile. But most of them leave it Leviathan, and I know some of you are thinking, wait a minute, the Bible would never use mythical characters. Sure it does. Turn over to the book of Revelation, and John sees a dragon, a red dragon with 7 heads and all of these crowns and horns. I mean, obviously mythological. I mean, it'd be like, me getting up here today to say, well, do y'all remember Yoda and what Yoda said to Luke Skywalker? None of y'all out there would go, oh, Les believes in Yoda, just because I used him as an illustration. But he brings up these two characters, Behemoth and Leviathan, and the point he makes is very simple. Can you put a nose ring in Behemoth? Can you do that? And of course the answer is, of course you can't. Or can you catch Leviathan on a rod and reel with a hook? I mean, you can't do it. And so he says, come on. God is a God who's far greater than even mythological characters. You can't put him in a box. And so at the end of the book, Job says, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is this that obscure my plans without knowledge? Surely, Job says, I spoke of things I did not understand. Things too wonderful for me to know. Reminds me, after I got into my 20s, just how smart my mom and dad got in just about 3 years. Y'all remember that? I mean, when you're 18 years old, mom and dad, goodness gracious, bless their hearts, dumb as a box of rocks. And then by the time you graduate from college, man, they're a lot smarter. I'm reminded of my son Kyle, my and June's son Kyle. She always gets on to me, they're my kids too. Okay, yes. One of the things that we did to our children is we said to them we would pay for 3 years of their college. We didn't want them to have the college debt June and I had when we graduated. But I told them, I said, we're not paying 4 years. Just in case you want to, act up. You don't want to take school seriously. And so if you graduate in 3 years, we'll pay all 3 years of it. If you graduate in 6, you're paying the last 3. And so it's kind of a way of us trying to encourage them. But our youngest son, Kyle, went to Lipscomb. Now, how many of y'all are Lipscomb grads? Blake, are you still paying on your college bills? Close, yeah. I mean, when our son Kyle went there, it was over $30,000 a year. And so June and I, we saved every penny we could, and we paid 3 years worth of college. 4th year, Kyle had to go borrow it. At the end of the 4th year, he came up to me and asked me this question. Dad, do you know how much debt I'm in? I said, I wouldn't have a clue. I said, son, do you know what Mom and I have done? We've sent a brand new F-150 to Lipscomb 3 years in a row. Don't talk to me about your debt. Yeah, his senior year, he discovers this cost money. Really? You see, sometimes it takes us a while to realize. And here's Job looking at God and going, wow. Hear me now, and I will speak. I'll be asking the questions, and you'll supply the answers. Job says, I know, God, you said that. Before I knew only what I had heard of you, but now I have seen you. Therefore I realize the truth. I disavow and mourn all I've said and repent in dust and ashes. This is from the Voice. NIV translates it that I kind of despise myself. I hate myself. I don't know that that's what's going on as much as, therefore I now realize the truth. And therefore I disavow and mourn all I've said. I repent in dust and ashes. In other words, Job realizes, yes, I did focus on me. And I didn't focus on you, and I was wrong. So what's the lesson of the book of Job? At the end of the day, what do we take from it? Because God never does answer Job's questions. He doesn't do it. You don't have a heavenly scene at the end with the Satan coming up and God saying, I told you so. None of that. Satan appears in chapters 1 and 2, disappears. Elihu disappears just as quick as he showed up. Bildad, Eliphaz, Zophar the same way. So what's the message? And the message of the book of Job is found in Job 28. That interlude. That weird little chapter that just shows up and you go, what in the world is going on here? Job 28 begins in verse 1 with all that man has ever done. The accomplishments of mankind. He says, only man has dug down into the mountains to find gold and silver and emeralds and rubies. Only man's been able to dig down to the very base of the mountains where no lion goes, no bird goes, no wild animal goes of any kind. Only man has the ability to do astonishing feats. Build the pyramids would be a good example, even though they're not mentioned. But at verse 12, he says, but where can wisdom be found? Where do you find wisdom? Where do you find an understanding about life? And he goes on in the chapter and he says, you can dig down, you won't find it there. You can go down to the depths, you won't find it there. You can go up high, you won't find it there. You can go to this, you can go to that. No matter where you go, you can't find it. And here's the way it ends in verse 28 of that chapter. And he said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to shun evil is understanding. And what I love about this is that when you take all three of the wisdom books, you take Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, they all three say that right there. Look at Proverbs. The fear of the Lord, that's the beginning of wisdom. The respect of God. Just don't try to put him in a box. And you go over to Ecclesiastes. After Solomon had tried everything in the world to see where meaning was found, he said, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless if you forget one thing, and that's God. And so he ends the book and says, now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God. Keep his commandments. This is, the word duty is not in the original. It's literally, this is life. This is life. And so if you take anything away today, it may not be answers to your questions, but it may be a realization that it's time to keep your focus on God. Job got it right a lot of times. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Anytime I get with people who are trying to figure God out, and they're convinced they've got him figured out, I just want to say you need to read the book of Job. Because God cannot be figured out. God can just be trusted, loved, and obeyed. And he will bless us. Whether in this life, if not, in the one to come. I don't know where you are in your life. I don't know if you've had your focus way too long on yourself. If you have, it's time to change your focus. It's time to put it on God. Don't be like Solomon, who waited to the very end of his life to discover everything he had pursued in life. Everything he thought would bring meaning to life ended up being meaningless. At the end, he says, oh, how I wished in my youth I'd followed God and never strayed. Because fearing God, keeping his commandments, that is what life is all about. If you need to respond to the invitation to follow Jesus Christ. By the way, Jesus came and illustrated that by living a perfect, completely perfect, blameless life. Still died on a cross. But he died there for you and me. And says, if you'll put your faith in me, be baptized, follow me the rest of your life, you'll find what all of these men of old were talking about. You can do that right now. Just let us know as together we stand and sing.